body is sending you smoke signals, send Alka-Seltzer to the rescue and put out the fire fast.
Alka-Seltzer to the rescue.
WAGA-TV, Atlanta.
An achingly empty Launch Pad 39B in Florida tonight. Newly refurbished Launch Pad 39B. Space Shuttle Challenger was the first to leave its embrace in more than a decade. It blasted off in a blaze of fire amid the ice on the pad. A scant minute later, gone in all a consuming ball of fire. All that was Challenger, all the technology and hopes, and 7 people riding on the top of 500,000 gallons of rocket kick. 6 astronauts and a teacher who was us all, gone forever in a matter of seconds. Hours later, national mourning and a national eulogy from the president.
For the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye, and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
This is a CBS News special report. Disaster in space. Reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York, here is Dan Rather.
It was there for all to see. Open, above board, almost routine. Another space shuttle launch. So many saw it happen. So little is still known tonight about why it happened. Tonight, the search planes and desperate rescue helicopter crews that had looked for signs of survivors all day in vain, tonight they were recalled. They will start again at first light. Ships are still crisscrossing off the coast of Florida. All they have found in the cold Atlantic is small debris from the once mighty Challenger. The largest pieces of that debris, no bigger than 2 feet wide and under 10 feet long. That is all that remains tonight of 7 hero pioneers and tons of high tech. Some of America's best and brightest young people, some of the most complex machinery and electrical apparatus in the history of humankind. It happened at Challenger's moment of full thrust, point of highest stress, where metal meets air at 2,000 miles an hour. It happened in real time before noon, a slow-motion horror for all who watched.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff. And it has cleared the tower.
The president, like all Americans, watched this on television.
The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave.
Challenger, go and throttle up. Challenger, go and throttle up.
Obviously a major malfunction. We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded.
They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them.
Joining us now in Los Angeles is Leo Krupp, a former shuttle test pilot for Rockwell International. Leo Krupp, good to have you with us this evening. What I would like for you to do, first of all, is let's take a look of the videotape from today. Talk us through it, where the places are, where there are questions, where the suspicions are. But before we do that, let's take a look at the scale model we have in the studio with us, Leo Krupp, and check me as we go along here. Just a reminder that the space orbiter, the spaceship itself, the space shuttle Challenger, is attached to this huge fuel tank which contains liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. The liquid hydrogen, highly explosive. Off on the sides are the solid rocket fuel boosters, 2 of them. And in space shuttles, the plan is for the whole apparatus, the engines at the tail of the space shuttle, plus the solid rocket boosters, all to go off the launch pad in one big thrust, and it has to be throttled back a bit, then throttled forward, and as it reaches just past the 2-minute mark, the plan is for the solid rocket boosters to jettison away and fall away, The space shuttle with its engines down here continues on up using the fuel out of this tank on upward toward space, and eventually the big fuel tank itself drops off, leaving the shuttle to orbit the Earth. Now, that's the way it has worked in the past. Now, Leo Krupp, I want to remind you, if I may, or perhaps point out to you if you had a chance to read it, that the United Press International says tonight that speculation about what caused the Space Challenger to explode shortly after takeoff Tuesday focuses primarily on the spacecraft's large fuel tank, but NASA officials declined comment on what may have triggered the blast. Now, with that in mind, let's try to take a look now at the videotape of the blast-off today. Leo, as we wait for the videotape to get completely down to the point where we want to take it up, had you heard that speculation about the suspicion area focusing on the main tank?
Well, there's no doubt, Dan, that the main tank was the explosion, the fuel for the explosion, and what triggered it, I think, is conjecture right now until NASA has a chance to look at all the items. There were some suspicious flame patterns around the nozzle area of the left, what appeared to be the left solid rocket booster, and that could have been the ignition source, but I'm sure that everybody agrees the fuel for the explosion came from the main tanks, from the external tank.
Well, let's take a look now at the videotape and have you talk it through us, emphasizing as we go through this that there may be many theories and many hypotheses, but no one at this hour actually knows what happened. This was the scene at the launch site.
7, 6, we have main engine start, 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the
everything in the launch looked perfectly normal up to the point when he was going through max dynamic pressure, and this camera angle will be looking up the stern or up the tailpipe of the vehicle as it gets up, so you can't really see too much. But just as he goes through the max dynamic pressure region where he throttles his engines back, the three main engines back to 65%, and then he throttles them back up to 104 after he's through this area, the camera will switch from the stern view to a side view. And when it switches to the side view is when you can see the first thing that looks abnormal, and those are some little what appear to be flame leaks around the aft end of the left booster, which is the one closest to you as you're viewing this.
Now, we're just about to see that, I think, Leo Krupp, in a few seconds.
Okay, as we switch to the side view, just watch toward the aft end of the solid rocket booster, and you'll see some little flame patterns come out, and those appear to be the ignition source. There you can see them, and there's no doubt the fuel for the explosion came from the external tank. But the question is what caused it, and NASA, I'm sure, will have an answer for this after they recover all the debris and look at all the data.
Now, Leo Krupp, let's do as we have done during the day, take a closer look at the critical moments just before and during the explosion in slow motion. This is the side view that you mentioned.
Okay, you can see the little flame leaks coming back there now, just forward of the nozzle. And you'll see one that jumps up forward and impinges up on the belly of the vehicle, up near where the umbilical from the external tank, right there. And that provided the ignition source which resulted in the catastrophic explosion.
Leo Krupp, former shuttle test pilot for Rockwell International. So our viewers and listeners can understand the area in which you called attention as one of the suspicion areas, while emphasizing all the way through that nobody actually can know what happened and why. What you were talking about, Leo, is was this area, this being the solid rocket booster on the left side from the pilot's position in the capsule, right down in here is where you first saw those flashes.
That was the first thing that looked out of the ordinary or abnormal about the flight. Up to that point, everything looked perfectly nominal. It looked like a perfect launch.
And then, very quickly, there was a brighter flame a little further up on what appeared to be the area of the main fuel tank, that is the liquid fuel tank, liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, and then very quickly the massive fireball explosion.
That's right, and it appeared that this happened so rapidly that the crew did not have any time to react. There is a provision for the crew to do a fast separation. If they know something is amiss in a solid rocket booster or the tank, they can do what we call a fast separation, and they can separate the shuttle from that package. But this occurred so rapidly that it appeared that the crew did not have any time to react at all to the pending disaster.
Leo, on our model, what you're talking about, there is a provision where if the commander and pilot have an indication in time, if they can quickly separate just the space orbiter itself away from all the fuel, but there's no indication anywhere at any time today that they had even a second or two to do that. No indication at all. The other thing we want to mention is the large fuel tank, the one that United Press International says is the focus of the investigation as it begins as to where the explosion may have started. That massive external fuel tank is manufactured by Martin Marietta Aerospace in Louisiana. It contained 500,000 gallons of highly explosive fuel. The fuel is the most explosive element in the whole system, but we emphasize that nobody at Martin Marietta Aerospace or with NASA is saying that the explosion actually began in this tank. They simply do not know. Thank you very much, Leo Krupp in Los Angeles. We want to go now to Houston, where our old friend astronaut Alan Bean, former astronaut and present artist and painter Alan Bean, who flew on both the Apollo and Skylab missions. It's tough, I know, but Alan Bean, what runs through your mind as you watch the launch, having been there yourself? And if I may, I'm particularly interested in, based on your experience, what was happening to the crew members minute by minute from the seconds before launch right on through this disaster.
Well, Dan, from the time you get in up till about 15 minutes, you've got a fairly leisurely pace, and so you're thinking about the launch and you're thinking about how the mission's going to go. When it gets to be about 15 minutes to launch, things start to pick up speed, and you begin to just concentrate on your gauge readings, what the ground's telling you, and getting ready for the launch. At launch time, when the main engines ignite, you're watching the instruments. You're not thinking about anything except, what is it that I'm seeing? Is this right? And if it isn't right, what do I do? And that kind of mental attitude continues all the way through launch. So I feel fairly certain that the crew members, all during the first minute or minute and a half of launch, were looking at their gauges, listening to Houston, and thinking, it's going well, everything's going good, everything's going just like we hoped it would go. And my feeling personally is that is what they thought all the time.
Now, this happened with such suddenness, Alan Bean, and there was no indication, no one heard any indication, no one saw any indication that the spacecraft was in any difficulty whatsoever. Things happen so quickly in there. We're talking about seconds and in some cases nanoseconds. Speculation pure and simple, but would the commander and the pilot have had a gauge indication that something was wrong?
One of the things that you do when you design spaceships, of course, is you try to design them so they never fail, and that doesn't work. So if that doesn't work, then you say, what parts could possibly fail? Maybe a computer. Okay, we'll put 5 of them on board. How about the external tank? Well, we can't put 5 of those on board. They're too big. We better build the one we have and make sure it works. Don't bother putting a lot of instrumentation on there, because if something does go wrong, there's nothing you can do anyway. So I feel that if it was a failure of the external tank or the solid rocket booster up in the middle of it somewhere, like Leo's talking about, that there's no instrumentation there that the crew can readily get an indication that something's going wrong. So from their point of view, from their perspective, everything looks good.
There were no ejection seats in this space shuttle. There were in some of the very earliest of the space shuttle flights. There were ejection seats in the crew area, but none in this one today.
No, Dan, and my personal feeling as a result of what I just said is, even if this had been the first flight of the space shuttle, where John Young and Bob Crippen with ejection seats, that this kind of failure happened so fast and apparently with no warning, that they wouldn't have been able to use them. This kind of catastrophe is not what what the seats are designed for. This is a catastrophe that just cannot be allowed to happen. In this case, of course, it did, and the engineers are going to have to go back and take a look, because this there is no crew member recourse for this kind of failure.
Inside the cockpit of the space capsule, is there flame-resistant, flame-retardant material in there?
There is, but there's nothing that could absorb the energy that is in either the solid rocket boosters. Looks like neither of them came apart, because we could see them after the explosion. but there's certainly nothing in there that could absorb the force of an explosion of the hydrogen and oxygen that's in the tank, nor, I might add, when this occurs, the shuttle would be put at a strange attitude relative to the air. It's going 2,000 miles an hour, as you pointed out, maximum airflow, maximum airspeed. The shuttle would come apart. It just can't be built for those kinds of forces. This kind of failure cannot be allowed to occur when you design a spaceship. It's that simple.
And there's every indication today that it exploded in that great fireball almost instantly. Alan Bean,
yes.
Thank you very much for being with us this evening. The 7-member crew of Space Shuttle Challenger was varied from different backgrounds with different training. But as Bruce Hall reports, what these heroes shared was the pursuit of excellence.
And then
it was going to be Krista McAuliffe's flight. The 37-year-old Concord, New Hampshire schoolteacher, married, mother of 2, had captured the attention of the nation. She was going to be the first private citizen, not connected in any way to the space program, to be given a ride on the shuttle. She was picked from more than 11,000 teacher applicants and was fiercely proud of representing her profession.
I feel a great responsibility and excitement this year that I'm representing my profession.
Shuttle Commander Francis Dick Scobie was happy to be part of the teacher mission. His wife is a prominent educator, and he believed the space program needed the involvement of teachers and children. He was a space veteran who had flown aboard the Challenger in April 1984, and before leaving, he told friends that the future of mankind depended on flights like this to outer space.
We have to expand into outer space to keep our hands on the resources we need to make the human race survive. So I think it's our survival eventually.
The pilot was 40-year-old Mike Smith, a Navy commander and veteran of Vietnam. It was his first flight, and safety was his primary concern.
My primary interest is to make sure that we get up and back safely.
36-year-old Judy Resnick was the second American woman to go in space, flying aboard the Challenger in August '84. She was a classical pianist and had a PhD in electrical engineering. A research scientist, she was the only one aboard who was single. Ellison Onizuka and Ron McNair had gone through special training so they could take a walk in space to fix any emergencies that might occur aboard the shuttle. It was Onizuka's second flight. He was an aerospace engineer and a pilot who had spent much of his career teaching other pilots at the elite test pilot school. 36-year-old McNair had a PhD from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and was an expert in the field of lasers. It was his second trip into space. 41-year-old Greg Jarvis was overjoyed to finally get aboard the shuttle. He had been bumped twice, first by Senator Jake Garn and later by Congressman Bill Nelson. It was his first flight, but he was the one who tried to relieve the pressure on the others. It was his idea to take Krista McAuliffe for a bike ride when she became restless following Sunday's postponement. It was a crew doing what they know best, a crew doing what they wanted to do in life. Bruce Hall, CBS News.
As Bruce Hall mentioned, Senator Jake Garn, Cactus Jake Garn of Utah, flew in a shuttle mission. He was the senator who flew in one of the shuttle missions, followed, of course, by a member of the House of Representatives. And Senator Garn has just returned from talking to the families at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. He's been kind enough to take a moment or two at Andrews Air Force Base in suburban Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C., to talk with us. Senator Garn, is there anything that you got from the families? Did they say anything to you that you feel you can or want to pass along?
Well, I was fortunate enough to go with the Vice President and Senator John Glenn to visit with the families. And obviously, it was a very difficult meeting. You always feel inadequate and not knowing exactly what to say to try and comfort the families. The thing that I was so impressed with is Mrs. Scobie, the commander's wife, stood up when we came in and said, "Mr. Vice President and Senators, I think I speak for all of the families here that we want you to know that we want the space program to continue. We don't want it delayed. We know that our loved ones would want it to continue, and as tragic an accident as this has been, and as sad as it is, don't let it stop the space program." It was very, very touching and very difficult for us.
As any of us who've known them knows, Senator Garn, and as Tom Wolfe wrote so eloquently in his book, The Right Stuff, being a pilot's wife, a military pilot's wife, who some of these women had been for a very long time, is trying under the best of circumstances, to say nothing of circumstances in which your husband and the father of your children is going to ride a machine such as one of these space shuttles. You made that trip once. At about the 1 minute and 12 or 15 second mark, do you remember what you were thinking on your flight?
Well, during that period of time, the solid rocket boosters burn for 2 minutes, and it's very rough and it's very noisy. And so you thinking how exciting it is, how wonderful it is within a few more minutes, about another 6 minutes, you're going to be in orbit and be able to look back at the Earth. And when the 2 minutes are over, it dramatically smooths down. So you're relieved to get rid of the solid rocket boosters. They were about halfway to that point. I'm sure they were extremely excited, ecstatic about getting into space after being delayed a couple of days. I'm sure they were very happy and very excited at that point and thinking about what a wonderful, fantastic experience it would be in just a few minutes to be orbiting the Earth.
Senator Garn, do you remember what you saw and what you heard at that moment? Were you praying? Did you have your eyes open or closed? What did you see and feel and hear?
Well, at that moment, again, you're halfway through the solid rocket booster burn. As I remember, Charlie Walker, who was sitting next to me in the middeck, were clapping and shaking hands because we came within only 55 seconds of being canceled. And that was all we had left in our flight window for that morning. So we were cheering and clapping and shaking hands about that point into the flight.
Senator Garn, thank you very much for being with us this evening. I trust that you passed along, you and Vice President Bush, the respect, honor, and sympathy of the nation to those families. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. We did.
The stunned shock in the hometown of teacher Krista McAuliffe. The equally solemn and sad reaction in the Houston suburb where so many NASA astronauts and employees live, Clear Lake City, Texas, near the Johnson Space Center. Martha Teichner is there.
The town where astronauts live and work closed ranks. There was no information, just this sign, turn on your lights and pray for our astronauts. People did. An armed guard stood outside Mission Commander Dick Scobie's house tonight. The Johnson Space Center, where reporters are usually dished out data by the pound, got nothing. There were no news releases, no interviews. Nobody connected with the space shuttle was allowed to talk. A stunning, staggering silence was NASA's response to the tragedy that was inevitable someday. From those terrible minutes just after the launch, as the technicians who worked with the crew helped them in and out of their simulators, called them by their first names, realized what had happened. There was a compulsion to be near a television, to see the explosion replayed over and over. Tourists stood near NASA workers, their faces full of their feelings.
7 people snuffed, and the only thing good you can say about it is that they didn't feel it.
But when you saw it, it totally was engulfed. My God, what a sight.
One by one, the flags up and down NASA Road 1 were lowered to half-mast, and people stared at them, disbelieving. The walls at PT's restaurant are covered with pictures of astronauts, including 3 members of the Shuttle Challenger's dead crew. No astronauts came in tonight for dinner or happy hour.
Well, it just doesn't seem possible that they never come in here again.
So far, mourning has been an individual matter. Here, where astronauts live and work, it is everybody's tragedy. Martha Teichner, CBS News, Clear Lake City, Texas.
This horrible tragedy, this moment so vividly burned in our minds, it is one of those events that many of us are likely never to forget. Even now, many hours after we first saw that horrific ball of flame, it is hard to believe it happened at all. Bernard Goldberg looks at America's reaction to the deaths of 7 of our own.
T-minus 15 seconds. In the American mind, it had become routine, all those successful launches. In reality, of course, it never was routine, not for all the Americans who would watch close up, and certainly not for the people who would ride the shuttle into space. No, it never was routine, and at 11:39 Eastern Standard Time this morning, the proof exploded before our eyes.
You just can't believe that something like that has happened initially, and then when it sinks in, you know, it's just like, you know, losing a member of your family.
Today, our shock turns to sadness. We salute those who risked and gave their lives to serve our country at the last great frontiers.
And in the small towns around the Cape, this American tragedy was a community tragedy as well.
This community has been a part of the Space Center and its progress. We've shared the joys. Certainly today, we've shared a great tragedy.
I was a school teacher myself for 31.5 years, and I taught the age that she left, and it really touched my heart. I have grandchildren the same age.
I was first shocked because I didn't know what had happened and thought it was a dream that you'd wake up out of.
They were pioneers with high hopes and old-fashioned courage. They made it look like fun. So, in the American mind, it was becoming routine. Of course, it never was. This is Bernard Goldberg.
President Reagan had planned to deliver his State of the Union speech tonight, and at one point today, the president said he was going ahead with it, but he quickly changed his mind just a bit later, and instead, as Leslie Stahl tells us, he scrapped the State of the Union speech, postponed it until next week for a special address today to a nation in a state of shock.
President Reagan ordered all flags on public buildings flown at half-staff, proclaiming a week of national mourning, leading the country in what he called our pain. The president said, "I just can't rid myself of the thought of the sacrifice and the families."
The families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge, and I'll meet it with joy.
The president has taken a keen interest in the space program ever since 1982, when he was the honored guest at the happy landing of the shuttle Columbia. Ironically, the Challenger was flown overhead that day in a proud salute to the commander-in-chief. Despite the sorrow of today's tragedy, the president said the program will go on.
There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue.
It was President Reagan's idea to send civilians into space and to make a teacher the first. He spoke to the teacher finalists in June.
When one of you blasts off from Cape Kennedy next January, you will be representing that hope and opportunity and possibility. You will be the emissary to the next generation of American heroes.
The President and Mrs. Reagan are here tonight at home, Mr. Reagan having postponed his upbeat State of the Union address. At first, he said he was going to go ahead with the speech because, and I quote, "You can't stop governing the nation because of a tragedy of this kind." But then after congressmen, Republicans and Democrats urged a cancellation, it was finally decided that the budget was not what most Americans want to hear about tonight. This is Leslie Stahl at the White House.
From the great Atlantic Ocean to the wide Pacific shore, a nation mourns 7 heroes. From New Hampshire to Florida to Texas and beyond, they saw a space shuttle explode into smithereens. 7 lives lost just like that. The danger of space flight is real. That was real fire, real flames, and real death. But says President Reagan, we will continue our quest in space. Is it worth the risk? Has the space program come too far, too fast? We'll examine those questions when our coverage of the Challenger disaster continues.
This is CBS.
Sometimes all a mother has to give is love, and sometimes even that is not enough. This woman's children are sick and suffering from malnutrition. She's too weak to carry more than one of them to a place where she can get help 5 days' walk away. She has to choose which one to take. Even though she knows the others may not survive. You have a choice too. UNICEF cards. Every time you buy them, you help save a child's life by bringing vaccines and medicine to the millions who need them. Call now The choice you make can help others have better choices than this.
WAGA-TV, Atlanta. A CBS News special report, Disaster in Space, continues. Here again is Dan Rather.
It has been in recent years so easy to think of the space program as so many comfortable bus rides by technocrats. So easy to forget that our astronauts were adventurers, as much as the Argonauts of Greek myth, as much as Sir Francis Drake and Lindbergh, adventurers riding a pillar of flame. And though the 2.5 decades of manned space flight, there have been moments of terror and death. Almost exactly 19 years ago, January 27, 1967, a confident astronaut crew, Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee, they met death when fire swept their Apollo 1 command module during a ground test. In 1970, astronaut James Lovell floated in weightlessness, but then Apollo 13 exploded on the way to the moon.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. We've had a main B bus underboat.
We had a main B bus underboat. An oxygen tank had been mishandled during manufacturing. Apollo 13 finally returned safely to Earth. The dangers of space travel apply to all. The Soviet Union, the only other nation to send manned vehicles into space, has reported the deaths of at least 4 cosmonauts. On October 12, 1964, a Soviet cosmonaut completed a successful 24-hour space odyssey, but in 1967, he would become the first person to die during a space flight when his Soyuz 1 crashed after re-entry. With us tonight in Colorado Springs, Colorado, is an authority on the Soviet space program. He is Nicholas Johnson, advisory scientist for Teledyne Brown Engineering. Good evening, and thank you very much for being with us. The Soviet Union, at last report, had reported today's American space disaster in one line. Does this put them ahead? Can it put them ahead?
No, it doesn't put them ahead.
And how much do we know about the Soviet accidents over the years? Now, I mentioned that I know we're having some audio problems there, and we hope those get cleared up for you. That the Soviets have reported the deaths of 4 cosmonauts, but you and others have written that there's some reason to believe that they've had more accidents than they've been willing to make public.
Well, we only understand that they've had 4 actual fatalities on 2 different missions about 4 years apart, the first in '67 and the second in 1971. But at 4-year intervals, there have been 3 other near-fatal accidents, the last occurring in September 1983, when 2 cosmonauts almost suffered an identical fate to what happened today.
The Soviets have favored unmanned space exploration, have they not? Well, they've accomplished many things with manned space flight, to make no mistake about it, but they've favored unmanned exploration.
Well, if you look at the ledger, then certainly they have launched more unmanned spacecraft than we have. But they've also launched more manned spacecraft, so percentage-wise, it's pretty much equal.
They don't use the same kind of propulsion system that we do for launch and getting into orbit, though.
No, they don't use the more exotic liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen. They simply use liquid oxygen and kerosene, which dates back to the V-2 rockets of World War II.
To have it clearly understood, the V-2 rockets used more solid rocket fuel. So go ahead.
No, they were liquid fuels, but they were simply kerosene and oxygen and not liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen.
And the technique, the knowledge of how to use liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen as we do in getting our space shuttles into orbit, the Soviets have that technology and know-how, or they don't, or we don't know.
They have never demonstrated it, but we believe they're working on 3 new vehicles, one very similar to the space shuttle, which will use exactly the same technique.
Mr. Johnson, when I asked you the question at the beginning where you had some trouble hearing whether this could put the Soviets ahead, you study the Soviet space program very closely, and you have for a long time. It's always hard to make a comparison, but obviously, clearly, this is going to set back the U.S. space program. And what advantage will that be to the Soviets? Are they in a position to take special advantage of that?
I don't think it will give them advantages because we're not traveling the same path in space right now. They are concentrating on manned occupation of low-altitude satellites. For the last 6 years, they've occupied that station for about half of each year. What we have been doing recently is simply deploying satellites and gaining new experience, which we lost in the late 70s. I don't think that this actually gives the Soviets an advantage. They're simply applying their techniques in a different manner.
Mr. Johnson, we want to move on to other coverage, but why have the Soviets never put a man on the moon? They tried for a long while.
Well, I think what happened, they were running very close behind us in 1968. And when we were successful with Apollo 8 around the moon in December of that year, then their program, which was a little bit farther behind, simply got canceled because they could not catch up quickly enough.
Thank you very much, Nicholas Johnson, Advisory Scientist for Teledyne Brown Engineering. The Space Shuttle, a truck, a kind of flying workhorse, reusable and lately used for the first few times as part of the U.S. military space program. This brought something brand new to the whole Space Shuttle program, secrecy and news blackouts about U.S. military payloads. CBS News Defense Department correspondent David Martin reports it's no secret the Pentagon is no fan of the shuttle, now more than ever.
Later this year, the Space Shuttle Challenger was to have carried a top-secret military payload into space, one of 5 military missions scheduled for the Space Shuttle this year. Now the Challenger is no more, now that all shuttle flights are grounded indefinitely, Pentagon officials are scrambling to determine just what effect today's tragedy will have on the military's race into space. The Pentagon is counting on the shuttle to carry vital communications and intelligence satellites, as well as Star Wars experiments, into space. By the 1990s, officials foresee a need for 24 military space launches a year, more if a Star Wars defense against Soviet missiles is actually deployed. With that kind of schedule, the Air Force already has warned that if one of the shuttles were to be lost, quote, we could never catch up.
We have main engine start. We have a cutoff.
Even before today's catastrophe, there were increasing doubts about NASA's ability to meet the Pentagon's space needs. So the Air Force is hedging its bets by building new rockets to back up the shuttle. The first of the new rockets will not be ready until 1988. By then, the Air Force will have run out of these older Titan rockets, which it currently uses. Now it appears the Air Force will run out much sooner, as the rockets are used to fill the void left by the loss of Challenger. Officials say some of the damage to the military space program can be limited by the fact that the Pentagon has the power to bump scientific and commercial payloads from the shuttle.
One way or another, Pentagon officials say they will figure a way to get all their satellites and experiments into space. But today's disaster will almost certainly add billions to the cost. This is David Martin at the Pentagon.
This is the 25th year of manned space exploration, just 25 years. A mere speck of time, really. And we've gone from brief space flights to short turnaround space shuttles. We launch satellites and walk in space so routinely. But are we pushing the limit? Should we slow down? Joining us again from the Johnson Space Center near Houston is former astronaut Alan Bean. Also in our Washington CBS News studio, Congressman Mervyn Dimely, head of the Congressional Space and Technology Caucus, and here in New York, Myron Mauchline, a former director of the Space Shuttle program. Gentlemen, what about it? Are we pushing the limit, and should we slow down? First, former astronaut Alan Bean.
Dan, I don't think so. I think one of the things that I've noticed in NASA all the time I was there, some 18 years, was that they never compromised safety. They never pushed too hard because of cost. They never compromised safety because of any political pressure or anything. So I feel that whatever went wrong was a mistake and will be rectified. But I don't believe it was because NASA was pushing too hard. I feel they never go beyond the limit of safe operations.
Congressman Mervyn Dimely, as head of the Congressional Space and Technology Caucus, have the budget pressures on NASA been costly to us? And has that been one of the things to put the pressure on the space agency?
More than budget pressures. First, NASA has an excellent safety record, certainly better than the automobile industry, better than the aircraft industry. However, as your Pentagon correspondent just commented, NASA is under great pressure from the military, great pressure from the Congress, from the administration, from the private sector, and from the insurance industries. This accident will, of course, increase insurance rates, and that's a pressure. And we are under pressure from possible competition from a consortium in Europe. So NASA is under great pressure from a number of sources to make these explorations profitable or self-supporting. And therefore, as a result of that, they have to meet a very rigid schedule. Any interruption in that schedule throws the whole NASA program back. And I believe that the time has come for us to just step back just a minute and reorder our schedule priorities and try to slow down the program just a little bit.
You're not recommending, or are you, any reduction in NASA's budget? You're saying let up a little on the schedule.
Indeed. In fact, NASA has done very well. Over the last 5 years, they've had a net increase in their budget. I believe that they're doing an excellent job. I think, however, the schedule is too much like the Washington, D.C., New York shuttle run.
Myron Malkin here in New York, former director of the Space Shuttle program. Your view, an overview, and as objectively as you can, have we been moving too fast? Have the pressures been too great on the Space Shuttle schedule?
No, I don't believe that we're moving too fast. I agree with Alan Bean that the primary issue in NASA has always been safety, and the shuttle is designed with that thought in mind. The exact cause of this of the disaster today has yet to be determined. It's necessary to keep moving forward, and I don't believe that we've compromised safety in any way at the present pace. The shuttle program has been set up, and the manufacturing facilities and launch facilities have been constructed with schedule in mind as we proceeded forward, and I think they're adequate to do that.
Astronaut Alan Bean, what about this report today? We're talking about safety and whether the pressure on NASA to get these launches, particularly after they've been delayed a time or two, up there and out there and move on to the next one. When you were an astronaut, if someone had told you that there were icicles forming on the bottom of the spaceship, as happened this morning, would you have been concerned about that, even if NASA said, well, we've looked it over and we've delayed for 2 hours? Would that have been of concern to you?
If someone mentioned it, I would say to myself, I wonder what having icicles on there means. And I would say, I know that back in Launch Control Center, they're checking with the experts on icicles, if you will, to see what he thinks, or the team that's concerned with temperature or the environment around the spacecraft and the booster. And I would feel confident if they came back to me and said, icicles are okay, that they said that from a position of knowledge, testing, study. They didn't just look out the window and say, it ought to be okay, I think it's okay. They would have had data to prove it's okay, or they wouldn't have gone. They'd have said, let's don't go, we'll do some testing and go some other day.
And what about the report that over the weekend that one of the cranes that was helping to set up the shuttle launch accidentally bumped into one of the fuel tanks? Now, Mr. Moore, the current director of the Space Center, this afternoon, when asked that question, said, well, yes, in effect, that happened, but we checked it out and we think everything was okay. Would that have been of concern to you?
No, because once again, Mr. Moore has his own integrity, plus the integrity of his team behind him. Believe me, NASA operates as a close-knit family, like you said earlier in this program, and nobody is going to let anything go by that they feel is a safety consideration. Things that have bitten us before in the space program are things that we didn't know. We thought we knew, and then they were wrong. We've never had a failure that I know of in the space program where people stood up and said, this needs to be fixed, it's going to be a failure later on, something's going to break, this is going to blow up. If they ever say that, we go study the problem and we solve it, and we make sure finally that everybody agrees it's safe. So if you take a look back in the history of the space program, you'll find that things that have hurt us in the past have been things that we all agreed were okay, and we found out later we'd made a mistake. So I feel that that's what's going to happen here, that it's not going to be something anybody knows about at this moment.
Congressman Dimely, what about this business of allowing civilians, politicians, school teachers, and journalists? School teacher Krista McAuliffe, we all admire her, we all thrilled with her when she was chosen. But as we step back and look at it, has that been premature, as former astronaut Frank Borman suggested at one time today?
Well, I think it was perfectly proper to have a school teacher on, because what we are attempting to do is to explore space and to bring this message back to our classrooms. The whole question of whether politicians ought to go reminds me very much about the media hype we witnessed for the Super Bowl. I don't think it is necessary for politicians to go up. I think scientists, of course, should go up, and a teacher, in fact, is a scientist in his or her classroom. So I think that's a proper role for a teacher.
Former director of the Space Shuttle program, Mr. Mauchline, we earlier quoted a United Press International report saying that speculation, clearly underline that word, speculation in the early investigation is focusing on the spacecraft's large fuel tank, that massive external fuel tank that's manufactured by Martin Marietta Aerospace in Louisiana. Do you have any information on your own that would indicate that's true? And whether you do or not, what checks are made on these contractors for quality control?
I would say that there's no question that the source of the major amount of energy that contributed to the explosion came from the external tank. But you can't, I would be very hesitant to indict that element at this time. There's a lot of material to be gone over before we can decide that that is the case. The earlier suggestion that was showing up in the films about those little flashes from apparently coming from the solid rocket booster have to be examined very carefully to determine whether or not those are the cause. As to the quality, the control that goes into making the external tank, that's a welded aluminum structure. And there's about 1 kilometer of weld in that tank. All the joints are x-rayed, and early on in the program, they were getting to a place where there was, I think, less than an inch of weld that had to be reworked. So I would not think that that could be a problem. We have to really wait for all the data to be examined to get a better idea of what's really happened.
Mr. Mauchline, we know that we've had quality control programs in things such as nuclear submarines, welds that are not exactly and precisely made, and there have been many complaints about the decline of craftsmanship and quality in the manufacture of American weaponry and things such as submarines and space shuttles. Now, surely you faced that when you were in your job as the director of the Space Shuttle program.
There is always quality issues that are dealt with, and you cannot say that everything is perfect. But the procedures that are in place to detect those things are excellent. I can't be categorically say that it was not the tank, but it's a relatively passive part of the shuttle itself. It stores a lot of energy, but not a lot is going on inside the tank. The things that are going on that are very active and is in the solid rocket boosters and in the main engines. And so that's a place that everything will be examined. That's one of the places that I'm sure will be examined very carefully.
Alan Bean, when astronauts get together to talk, do they discuss the possibility that someone who made a weld or someone who put a bolt in place might have been out late the night before, or might have been somebody's brother-in-law and got the job that way? Surely that must be a real and present fear with the astronauts.
Well, we talk about it. We wonder if the people that sewed the parachutes, for example, all worked well, if they did the weld, everything else. And NASA managers, like Mr. Malcolm who's one talked about it, they know that too. They know people do have off days. And so we've had to set up a system of check and balances in the space program to take that into account. For example, someone does the job, then you have an inspector at that point, and then you have another inspector. Then all three people agree that is, let's say the weld is done properly. Then you take it down to the Cape and you assemble it. You have inspectors, once again, more than one, to look at it, say that it's okay. Then you get it on the launch pad, and then you test it. You put pressure in it. You overpressure it a little bit. You do all these different tests to ensure that the fella 6 months ago or a year ago back at the factory didn't make a mistake. And when these systems of checks and balances are finished, then I think everybody has confidence. I know we as astronauts always had confidence in the hardware.
Thank you, Alan Bean. Congressman Dimely, how far, in your opinion, is the American space program set back now? A year, 2 years, less or more than that?
I would say less than a year. There's no question in my mind the program must continue, and NASA has suffered a major setback. But I think one has to look at the human factor. To what extent is pressure bringing about these delays? To what extent is pressure causing these technical difficulties? One cannot ignore these human factors, and it seems to me we need to step back a bit and re-examine the whole procedure, the whole scheduling process, which brings stress and brings pressure onto the whole production of the program.
Thank you very much, Congressman Dimely, for being with us tonight. In the hometown of Challenger astronaut Ron McNair, Lake City, South Carolina, CBS News correspondent Sandy Gilmore visited the home of Matthew Brown, McNair's former teacher, and they were joined by a former classmate, George Simmons.
And did people get together, Mr. Brown, or what happened in town?
Well, people began to make calls and to get together, and of course, as soon as we got the news as a school system, we called the administrators, principals, and asked them to have mass flags and to pass the announcement around to student bodies and teachers.
There is a Ron McNair Boulevard in town. There is a Ron McNair Square, and is this the most famous person this town has ever seen on a national basis?
Truly, most definitely, I would say that it is, and Ron himself could not believe that this street would be changed from Boulevard to Ron McNair Boulevard. And
just a last question: what are the youngsters around here now? What's their recollection of Ron McNair? Is he someone they look up to, or?
Definitely, he's a person that everybody from initially before the space shuttle, just that he was qualified to be one of the NASA astronauts, qualified him to be looked up to. And after he came and visited all the schools, this was one of his highest priority to go into the schools. And everyone from that point on knew that, even though all the achievement that he made, his priority were, let's tell the children that the sky is the limit.
Teacher Krista McAuliffe's hometown of Concord, New Hampshire, is a city of about 30,000, a city rich in American tradition. And tonight, Charles Osgood reports Concord is a city in mourning.
There are places in this country tonight, and Concord, New Hampshire is one of them, where what happened today is being taken not so much as a public event, but as a personal loss.
A part of each and every one of us also boarded that space shuttle. And so only naturally, we feel that a part of us is gone.
My soul is longing for your peace.
All over Concord tonight, there were church services where people prayed for their friend and neighbor, Krista McAuliffe, and for her family and fellow astronauts.
And we, not understanding, are inconsolable.
The same thoughts were being expressed everywhere in Concord, in the stores and streets, and on the radio. This one thing was on everyone's mind.
Many of us were watching as the craft exploded.
Along with the sense of loss, however, is the feeling that this teacher, this warm, compassionate woman, has taught us something, even in death.
And others will dare to do more and to take her place because of the example of Krista and those who perished with her today.
On the front door of the house right next door to the McAuliffes is a wreath with a picture Krista sent to Jean Timmons, one of the 8 Timmons children. On the picture, Krista wrote a little note to Jean, and this is what she said. She said, "May your future be limited only by your dreams." Charles Osgood, CBS News.
CBS News correspondent Walter Cronkite was present at the creation of the American space age, covering this nation's space program through the sunshine and the showers, from its faltering beginnings through tragedy to the triumph of man on the moon and beyond. He filed this reflection on today's catastrophe from Santiago, Chile.
Even in our moment of such deep grief, we must look ahead to the future, for such is the nature of life. There will be, of course, long investigations and examinations of what happened today at Cape Canaveral. The argument will be buttressed for those who have been opposed to manned spaceflight all along. They'll now add the question of safety to their arguments. And NASA, of course, their engineers will have to look very carefully at what happened today to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Those of us who have watched the development of our space program from the very beginning, long before man first essayed a trip into space, we saw a lot of rockets blow up on the pad, soar into space, and then be destroyed. And I think in the backs of our minds always was locked the fear that someday all that volatile fuel would get loose when man was aboard, as indeed happened today. But America's pride in what it has accomplished in space in more than a quarter of a century of safe manned flight should not be diminished by today's terrible tragedy. We have come a long way in space, and there's still so much to be done out there. There are scientific, industrial, medical bounties to be reaped in space. To diminish what we have done in the past would be to dishonor those who lost their lives in that program on Challenger today. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News, Santiago, Chile.
A CBS News program reminder, we'd like to remind you that the CBS Morning News will continue our coverage live tomorrow morning from Cape Canaveral, Florida, with Forrest Sawyer and Maria Shriver. Why do they do it? What did they die for? Francis Scobie, spacecraft commander, veteran of a previous Challenger flight. Scobie talked about it in 1984.
You have to risk something to gain something, and the risk and the gain are worth it to me. I thoroughly enjoy doing what I'm doing, and if you allow risks to keep you from doing the things in life that pleasure you and make you what you are and make you feel better about yourself, I think you're shortchanging yourself.
Do you think we'd ever accomplish anything without taking some sort of risk?
No. You might as well just go in the bedroom, close the door, and turn out the lights.
They were 10 miles high when they died today, just like the old days of test pilots of the right stuff, showing their stuff. But it was not like the old days of out on the edge, seat of the pants flying with flyers all cut from the same cloth. These were Americans from all walks, from all backgrounds. Fighter pilots with war records, payload specialists with degrees, men, women, a teacher of children, a mother. They were Christian, they were Jewish, they were humankind up there going for us, going for the brass ring, for the thrill, for the knowledge, for the future. In a paraphrase of the poet James Dickey's work, put them high on the list of men and women who counted. These searchers and seekers, these astronauts and teachers who died today in what became the spaceship disaster. They died in the blue and silver furnaces of their spacesuits. Think about them, who they were, and the way they were. Dreamers, explorers, adventurers forcing themselves past the point of danger and deep fatigue to expand our understanding of what is up there and out there. They may never have known the nature of the trouble that killed them. For them, no more cries of, wow, what a view, no more jokes with mission control, no more thumbs up for cheering crowds, no more phone calls from the president. They will not see their parents and their wives or husbands and the children meeting them. Gone with the rush of the engines and the exploding sky. Gone, but theirs were lives that mattered.
This has been a CBS News special report. Disaster in space. This is CBS.
Good evening, I'm Pam Martin.
And